It's tabletop time. I'm Dave.
And I'm Jen.
And today we're going to be building an awesome, huge diorama of a massive dinosaur called the Mastodon.
Today's video is sponsored by One Page Rules, so we picked out our favorite model from June's release.
Now, if you don't know about One Page Rules and their awesome minis and games, we'll tell you a bit more about them later in the video. But for now, we need to get started. And you're probably wondering, just how big is this model?
Oh, I'll go grab it for you guys and I'll show you.
Well, that is a big dinosaur.
Right.
So the Mastodon is an absolutely massive print. It's bigger than a greater Narlock. It's bigger than a giant Squiggoth. It is very cool and made of multiple parts. We got these models pre-supported at the same time patrons did on the 4th of June, and we spent an entire week printing them. It was incredibly satisfying watching each piece come off the build plate and slowly creating the bigger picture of our awesome Mastodon. With all 3D prints, it is much easier to remove all the support before doing a final cure. So I got some hot water, bathed these resin prints in the hot water, and peeled off the majority of the supports. With the supports taken off with ease, it was time to give these models a spin in the curing machine. The extra UV time ensures that any of the uncured resin is completely cured, and it avoids the soft, tacky, and easy to scratch finish that some sort of undercured parts of models can have. While curing the model in stages, I began getting to work on a diorama base. A model of this size deserves its own backdrop and scene to really set it in place. And the jackals that this is part of the release of are definitely desert themed. To create this desert environment, I grabbed large chunks of foam, securing them together with some skewers, while a glue in the form of a silicone putty adhesive that we choose because it doesn't degrade or eat away the foam. With the rough shape in place, I moved outside and got out the hot foam cutter, carving into the rock walls and creating an organic rocky texture. With the diorama backdrop built and roughed out, we could return to the model and glue together the Mastodon. There are lots of elements on the Mastodon that join to the body. Lots of water reservoirs, barrels, pipes, etc. But for the majority of this build, we would split it into two sub-assemblies. One was the giant howdah on the top of the Mastodon. The other was the beastie itself. This would allow Jen and myself to work on these two different areas independently of one another, and we could swap back and forth as required. As well as this, I find it particularly unwieldy to paint extremely giant models with lots of complicated small pieces that you can snap off when painting them as a single part. So for a giant model like this, a sub-assembly is a super good idea. And with the delineation between beast and howdah so clear on this model, it seemed like the natural choice. And with the model assembled, it is becoming clear just how monumentally massive this thing is. This is super cool, and I can't wait to get down to painting it. But before we do, I do want to just talk a little bit about One Page Rules, the sponsor for this video, this awesome model, and how you can get your hands on it, and the rules for using it in your tabletop games. So if you like the look of this awesome giant dino, why don't we take a look at the rest of this month's release on One Page Rules' Patreon. This month, they're releasing more of their jackals, which might have began as a bit of a crude analog, but has definitely evolved into its own fully fleshed faction. They have a super cool desert nomad theme and a full gambit of units for use in One Page Rules' grimdark future game setting. As someone who's growing tired of the rules bloat of certain modern games, I must say One Page Rules' simple and fun game systems have really brought me back to the table, so I encourage you to check it out. One Page Rules has a Patreon, and every month they offer a full release with two factions split across their two games. As mentioned, this month we have the jackals, but we also have their awesome lizard folk. These saurian monsters have an amazing Aztec theme and are really sweetly sculpted. I especially love the epic loyalty reward of this giant pterodactyl mounted beast. One Page Rules also have a My Mini Factory store where they sell all of their releases, and if you sign up to their Patreon, you get a discount on their My Mini Factory store. So if you missed any of their past releases, sign up to their Patreon and get a discount code to get a huge percentage off their previous releases. For just $10 USD a month, you get access to over 50 amazing miniatures miniatures, as well as themed bases and terrain. The value included in these packs for wargamers is simply immense, and this is definitely the cheapest way to get all the models you need for an army to start playing tabletop wargaming today. So now you know the context of where I got this awesome Mastodon, I'm gonna set to work painting it. So with the model ready to paint and in sub-assemblies, it was time to work out who was painting what.
After much deliberation, we both decided that Dave would be painting the dinosaur and I would paint the little raft on top. Dave's got a pretty big project ahead of him. Mine looks relatively easy, but mine does have a lot of little small parts, so I think we've both got a challenge in store.
So often I like to try new things when I'm painting new models. And something I'd seen done recently, I believe Squidmar's been doing it quite a bit, is airbrushing contrast paints onto zenithal highlighted models. Originally, I sprayed it black, thinking that I was going to be painting this traditionally. But we ran out of black spray paint, and I had to use gray. And as soon as I started spraying gray paint down onto this model, I realized that I actually wanted to do this zenithal method. So I came in from above with Corax White and made sure to get a nice zenithal over the whole model. Then I loaded up my airbrush with a nice green in the form of Militarum green and a soft yellow in the form of the Skeleton Horde contrast paint. Now for the bulk of the body of the dinosaur, I sprayed vertical stripes on the top part of the body, reminiscent of many large monitor lizards. There's a large soft blanket on top of the model, and as a nice contrast to the green, I went with a soft red, and the natural mottling given by the zenithal makes it look really good as a fabric. The large bony crest on the dinosaur, I picked a deeper green to make it a bit of a focal point and clearly show it out as a more armored panel on the dinosaur. And then for the tufts of hair underneath, I went in with a brown through the airbrush. And with the airbrushing done, I was ready to move on to hand painting.
While Dave was busy in the corner painting up our beautiful new dinosaur, I got the big task of painting the howdah. I really wanted to ensure that the dinosaur was the focal point of this model, so I wanted to use a lot of muted colors but kept in the same color palette that Dave was using. To make things easier for myself, I decided I wanted to use a couple of sprays just to start putting some initial color down. The first thing I did was spray down a Vallejo brown to try and simulate some of the dusty effects that would be appearing on the model. And to make my life a little bit easier, I decided to spray lead belcher on top. Majority of this piece of the model had a lot of metal panels on it, so I thought this would be the easiest approach. However, this did mean that a lot of metal got on the more organic pieces of the model, so I'd have to go back in and fix those up. So for all of the ropes on this model, we used leather brown, and then for any fabric materials, we used khaki. A combination of all these colors gave the impression of a sandy desert feel, which is something we both really wanted to incorporate. Once everything had been base coated, it was time to put on a wash. Now I'm pretty heavy-handed with my washes, which actually kind of worked in favor for this model. I think with metal in particular, it works quite well to go on the heavier side. Once everything had dried, I gave everything a quick dry brush with Scale 75's Thrash Metal. And to finish it all off, I just added a bit of rust here and there to make it look more worn. And then line highlight all the panels and the rivets to really make them pop.
With the metals established over at Jen's table, I grabbed Thrash Metal and painted some on myself. I undercoated it in Abaddon Black first because the light zenithal would be a poor base coat for a metallic silver to have any kind of richness. I used leather brown to paint all the leather straps on the model, and as Jen had done, khaki for the ropes. With all these colors down, I came in with the airbrush and airbrushed on Agrax Earthshade in the metal areas. This caused a really cool effect with the air blowing the very watery wash all over, which made it really effective for the metal panels, but not very effective for trying to wash the straps. So I went in with a brush and fixed that up manually. Once this was done, I came in over the top with a final highlight of thrash metal just to pick some elements out. And I should also mention I did weather in much the same way as Jen, with some rust paint and browns stippled onto the metals. There are a few elements remaining to paint on the model. There's a lot of heads of models we'd used for Rob's Necron forces tied up as trophies on the side of the Mastodon. So I painted them to match Rob's army in their black paint scheme. In the face area and the mouth, I airbrushed in a nice red to get the tongue and mouth looking natural, allowing some deliberate overspray over the lip to have a really nice transition from the outside fleshy colors into the inside of the mouth. I then painted all of the teeth khaki as well as the tusks with a brush for the teeth and an airbrush for the tusks. And then I came in with Elvish White, which is a nice ivory off-white to highlight those. Getting the airbrush again with that Agrax Earthshade wash, I airbrushed in a lot of browns towards the bases of the tusks, allowing for a really nice natural gradient. And with all these elements done, the Mastodon's body is complete, and it's time for Jen to finish painting all the props that will be going on the Howdah.
The Howdah had a few different pieces to paint up. I decided to split these into different batches so I'd be able to paint them more easily. I started with the metal batch first, base coating it in the other colors that were necessary so I could put the wash on and leave them to dry. The other objects that required a leather brown, I knew I could spray these later on. So I popped out the spray booth, gave these a quick go, and just a dry brush on top. These models had some jackals on them, and after a little discussion between Dave and I, we decided to maybe incorporate a bit of Australia in here. We decided to make these into dingoes, or try to use more colors that dingoes would have. They've got this beautiful rusty color to them, and I really wanted to incorporate this somehow. I used contrast paints this time just to make it really stand out. Once I was happy how everything was looking, it was time to start weathering everything down. Again, we had this impression that this dinosaur was living in a desert world, so everything needed to be dusty and rusty.
With Jen working away, finishing up all the little bits and bobs, it was time for me to go in and make the diorama. We currently didn't have any sculptor mold in the studio, so Jen and I made up this crazy mix of sand, sawdust, glue, water, and a bug. It was in the tub, and by the time we put it on the model, there's a bug. There's a big beetle in the sand now, and we're living with it. It's gonna be great. So we covered the ground of the foam area in that to create a really nice bit of ground texture, and then put a few blobs up the top where some vegetation and dirt from the hills above had flown down onto the rocks. And then on the walls of the diorama, the foam, we made sure to give a coat of thin down PVA so that it would stand up to some spray paints later on. After that had been left overnight to dry, I came back in and started to decorate it. with that done, we can put our dinosaur on the base, chuck on some weathering pigments to blend everything together, and, well, enjoy. So there you have it, the awesome Mastodon model from One Page Rules, and thank you to One Page Rules for sponsoring the video once again. As we look at the turnarounds of our big beastie, I'd like to thank all of our patrons, and thank you to our newest patrons, Winter Behir,
Master Messor,
Sophia Murphy,
Jackson Dutton,
A1zo,
Michael Terrell,
and Richard, just Richard. Your support allows us to put out 2 videos a week and keep delivering the kind of awesome content we love to make and hopefully you love to see. And as a special treat, we actually thought it would be really fun to just muck about and play with the dinosaur. So we haven't glued it on the base so we can remove it. And we're gonna have a little scrimmage. It'll be Jen's whatever we find around the studio versus just the Mastodon. We're gonna film that and we're just gonna chuck that up on our Patreon as a really fun, just casual after hours battle report. It's just gonna be a scrum. Should be a bit of fun. So thank you for watching the video. We hope you enjoyed and
yeah.